Delighted to welcome Dr. Nicole Renehan, who is the Assistant Professor in Criminology at Durham University, and Dr. Tom Smith, who is an Associate Professor in Law at the University of the West of England. Tom and Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sam. Good just about afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing to see so many of you to come and listen to us talk a little bit about the evidence review, which we were very kindly invited to sort of put together for Russell and for Clinks. And it's been an incredibly kind of rewarding experience to do this, partly because there's such a range of experience and expertise on this area, and being able to kind of draw it together and put it into a really accessible format to benefit people who are practicing every day in the criminal justice system is something that feels really impactful. So yeah, it's really is our pleasure. I don't know if you want to say anything, Nicole, before I babble on too long.
You could never babble on too long, Tom. Yeah, just echoing what Tom said, it's been a real pleasure having the opportunity to pull this evidence review together. It's really great for the network to be able to have drawn on some of the wider expertise, looking at different areas. And I suppose what we'll see today is a lot of it cross-cuts. And then there's some sort of more, I think, individual sort of practical tips across different sectors as well. So yes, we're looking forward to your questions, and hopefully we can answer them all. And if Tom and I can't, the contributors have also said that they're really happy to, that couldn't come today, for you to contact them individually with further questions about their particular area.
Yeah, and actually, Nicole, that's a really important point. Right from the start, we should, I think, very specifically thank the people who contributed, freely, gave their time freely for this this review. They're named in the report, in the review, and I think some of them are probably here today as well. But just to name check them now, thanks to Kaylee Atkins, to Luke Vinter, to Nicole, obviously, to Nikki Rutter, to Katie Maris. I'm sure I'm missing Jen Howe, Chloe Holloway-George, Clara Lely, Anne-Marie Day. Thank you so much for all the time and effort you put into putting together your contributions. So I don't know if the best way for us to start, Nicole, would be to just kind of briefly run through the content a little bit and give a little overview of what's there. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll let you go, Tom.
Okay. So in terms of ourselves, as Sam kindly said, we coordinate a network called the Neurodivergence in Criminal Justice Network, which at current numbers is about, I think, 300 strong in terms of people from across various different professions, backgrounds, people who have lived experience of the criminal justice system, coming together to share experience and knowledge on neurodivergence. So this was, being involved in this project was a really good fit for us because of that sort of background of bringing together so many different perspectives and levels of expertise. So from that sort of starting point, we kind of asked for contributions along the broad lines of the way the criminal justice system is largely constructed. So we asked for contributions around policing, in terms of neurodivergent suspects, witnesses. We asked for contributions on youth justice and for example, connection between schools and the criminal justice system. We had contributions on criminal courts and how neurodivergence is approached in that context, as well as prisons and probation and interventions with individuals who've been convicted of offences. And as Nicole mentioned, we finally tried to put together some kind of key broad tips and thoughts on making a more effective and neuro-inclusive service. So in terms of those kind of broad areas, the first of them focused quite particularly on the review that was published a few years ago by the Ministry of Justice and the Criminal Justice Joint Inspectorates on neurodivergence in criminal justice. And that was provided by Kaylee Atkins for us, who talked a little bit about what the evidence review did, what it concluded about the criminal justice system, and what needed to be done in order to improve how criminal justice services are delivered. And one of the key kind of points that kind of emerged from that really is the fact that there was a lack of lived experience input into that review and a lack of lived experience input into the recommendations going forward. So I'd sort of highlight that, first of all, as a really important point that came away from this evidence review, with the crucial nature of involving lived experience in developing better services. So I think that was a really important point for Kaylee to highlight in her section. I will hand over to Nicole in a moment, I promise. We then had a review of youth justice and neurodivergence for neurodivergent children and young people from Anne-Marie Day and Nikki Rutter, who talked about, first and foremost, how prevalent neurodivergence is in youth justice settings, and particularly the strength, the link between schools and things like school exclusion, and ending up in the youth justice system and then becoming caught in that well-known phrase, the revolving door of criminal justice. And they talked not only about what kind of needs are not being currently met effectively, but what kind of things need to change, such as having speech and language plans and assessments being provided for all children who are in youth justice processes, and having that better link between things like educational healthcare plans and the youth justice system. So really recognising and embedding that connection between youth justice and schools and education and the failures there. I didn't know if I'll talk perhaps about section 3, Nicole, and then I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about sections 4 and 5.
I think perhaps you would be better with 4 than because you wrote it.
That's a good point.
Would you like me to introduce section 3 and then you come back and talk about section 4? Okay. Yeah, so I'm not sure if Chloe and Claire are here today. However, they wrote a section forward looking at neurodivergence in policing, including custody. And I think some of the interesting stuff to come out of that was thinking about how neurodivergent people are often are more likely to have interactions with the police, as well as also being more likely to be victims of crime as well. But when we sort of look a bit deeper into thinking about the processes, when we think about arrest, when we think about custody, that quite often neurodivergence is missed. Never mind when we know about it, a lot of the times it's not fully understood, but when it's missed, often that means then that the accommodations, adjustments that neurodivergent people need are not put into place. And really interesting talk as well about the ways in which neurodivergent people present, that often that can be misunderstood to the detriment of neurodivergent people within the context of policing, because perhaps they behave in a way that might make them appear to be guilty, for example, or sort of be presenting in ways that might look like they're being confrontational, but actually this is about the way in which their neurodivergence presents for them. I'll pass back to you, Tom, whilst I turn my noisy email off if I can find how to.
Thanks, Nicole, and good point about I should talk about this bit. Yeah, so I was really pleased to be able to work with Jen and Katie on putting together the section on neurodivergence in criminal courts, which kind of feels like a somewhat not neglected area in terms of things like research and evidence gathering, but is, you know, kind of so important and so pivotal in taking people further into that criminal process. You know, these are spaces which are completely unfamiliar to most people. Most people don't spend much time in courtrooms unless they work in them. And, you know, one of the things we try to kind of highlight is that the design and the culture of court proceedings is really not well suited for neurodivergent individuals who are drawn into them, whether as witnesses or as defendants. And the general research that is available at the moment suggests that those professionals who work in this space, judges, lawyers, but also other decision makers like juries and magistrates, don't generally recognise and effectively respond to the needs of neurodivergent individuals, at least certainly not in a systematic way. And that may be in part because there's poor identification, but also there's just a rigidity of processes and an unwillingness to adapt criminal court proceedings to better help people engage, to help cope with those processes, and ultimately lead to more effective and fair hearings and the right outcome in cases. One of the things we tried to conclude there was that there are a number of things that need to change, and I suspect we'll talk about this in a minute when Sam has some questions for us. But certainly better identification is absolutely key in this space, and a willingness to change very long established ways of doing things in courts. And I'll hand back to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so in the final piece, myself and Luke Vinter came together. So for those of you who aren't aware of our work, Luke's research has focused on autistic people's experiences of accessing behavioural change programmes within a prison setting and how they experience the prison setting, who've also committed sexual offences. My work sort of started off actually within domestic abuse. That's sort of my area of expertise, looking at perpetration and how we engage men who are abusive towards their partners within behavioural change programmes in the probation context. And as part of that, I ended up interviewing sort of unsuspectedly some neurodivergent men, and that's sort of what's led me to look at this research now. So there's lots of overlap and stuff. It was really great to work with Luke on this because both of us obviously focus on sort of violence interventions in the context of sexual or domestic violence offending. Mine specifically focuses on autistic people and those with ADHD or ADHD. And the two things that we sort of really wanted to pull out, and I think cuts across our research, is that there's sort of two angles really to be thinking of. And the first one is about so the reasonable adjustments that neurodivergent individuals might need to sort of get them to the room in the first place. There can be sort of barriers in the way in terms of just getting someone to an appointment, into an intervention, and then actually getting them to stay there. When we think about some of the sort of sensory sensitivities that autistic people might experience, some of the challenges that ADHD individuals might experience in terms of sort of being and staying in that room as well. And some of the accommodations that sort of need to be made to ensure that they can engage meaningfully with that process. But there's also something beyond reasonable adjustments here in terms of thinking about accommodations, and that's about how we relate. And certainly coming into this particular area myself, I've sort of come to understand myself as a neurotypical as having been very privileged, that the entirety of my life has never had to consider the conversation or communication, social preferences of someone at the other end of that communication experience. And actually, this is something that we have forgotten or not considered when we're thinking about developing programmes that neurodivergent people, or we think about us within the context of neurodiversity, we all communicate very differently, and we haven't thought about what that looks like when we're talking to, relating to someone who might be sat in front of us in a room who's committed very serious offences, is already feeling very ashamed about doing so, and then has sort of communication barriers and differences in terms of engaging that person. So our work sort of really sort of tries to hammer that home a little bit, that yes, we need someone to be able to get to the room and stay there in the first place and to understand the material that's being used, but we also need to think about how we relate with each other in that context as well. So I'll leave that there.
Thanks, Nicole. And I appreciate before we let Sam ask the questions, we've sort of thought about, yeah, we've also got a final section with just getting started, some kind of thoughts on how to make services more neurodivergent friendly. And I think we should probably emphasize that obviously, there's no exhaustive list of what this might be. And you can just see, looking at the participants popping up, what a wealth of experience and diversity of experience there is in the room. So, that community of experience is absolutely vital, I think, to sort of building these better approaches. So hopefully some of the things we've said are useful, but I'm sure you'll have many of your own thoughts as well. So yeah, thank you for giving us the time to talk. And Sam, I don't know if that's a good time to hand over to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tom and Dr. Nicole. I won't take up too much of your time because Russell's going to take over shortly, and there will be plenty of time and space for all attendees to ask questions of the contributors. Some of these questions I've created not just based on my reading of the work, but also on some intellectual curiosity, but they are relevant to the review, I promise. So my first question, and up to the two of you who would like to respond, but we know amongst Clinch's members, of those working with people in prison and on their release, that the true extent of neurodiversity among people in prison and in the community isn't fully recognised. I wanted to ask, why is that the case?
Yeah, it's the golden question. I think it's at the centre of it. Do you want me to go with that, Nicole? I mean, I think there's a few different reasons. I mean, to begin with, I think it's pretty clear that the last few years have seen a really big growth in sort of interest and attention to this area. I think to an extent that has come through sort of the efforts of people to make people more aware within the criminal justice system, whether it's practitioners at a kind of a grassroots level, or whether it's charities, NGOs, academics. So I think to a degree there's that. I think prior to that there was really sort of a lack of full focus on this, particularly at sort of policy kind of level. And the criminal justice joint inspection back in 2021 seemed like quite a big turning point in that sense. With its kind of estimate of like something like half of the prison population being probably neurodivergent. That's a kind of a very big headline idea. So I think to a degree it's just not had the attention perhaps that it should have done. But at the same time, a big part of it is just a lack of information, lack of data. We don't systematically screen for neurodivergence. We don't record in any kind of consistent way whether people are neurodivergent across the criminal justice system. And we need to bear in mind it's a multi-agency system with lots of moving parts that don't necessarily kind of connect up with or join together very effectively. And I know that information sharing across the system is a universally difficult problem. So I think to a degree, identifying and sharing that sort of awareness has been lacking for a long time. And I personally also think that just the culture of criminal justice is sort of quite resistant to a degree to sort of seeing people as vulnerable and fallible, and being much more focused on things like personal responsibility, being culpable, punishing. And I think that culture's been met with resistance when trying to kind of recast people as actually this is somebody who has challenges and there needs to be some adaptation to that. So I guess the short answer is there's a few different reasons, but I think identifying is a big one.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really detailed answer. It really does give some more insight into why it remains such a problem. My second question for you is looking at a specific aspect of the prison system, the youth estate. What is the current picture within the youth estate regarding neurodivergence, and how are young neurodivergent people within custodial settings supported?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Tom and I have been very lucky to collaborate with experts in this field. So I think whatever we're giving you is a bit broad brush, and obviously focusing very much on the information that that the contributors have done in terms of their research. But I suppose one of the things really to point out that's important is that the journey often starts at school. That there's often a failure to identify neurodivergence and therefore support for children and young people at school. So that can almost be that sort of starting point into the youth justice system. So without sort of these support needs in school, very often neurodivergent children, young people are more likely to be excluded, which of course increases the risk of social exclusion and then contact the youth justice system. I suppose what we term the school to, or has, not we, but has been termed the school to prison pipeline. And often then when they enter the youth justice system, these sort of, I suppose the way in which they've been let down follows them in there. They aren't sort of, there's a continuation of failures to meet their educational and personal needs. And I suppose we could sort of say that that's the pipeline into the criminal justice system. I don't know if you want to speak, Tom, about the report that came out that you've had some, I think, had some involvement with there.
Yeah, well, very briefly, I mean, to be honest, the person who was involved in it primarily was Anne-Marie, who co-authored the section on youth justice. I don't know if Anne-Marie's in the room, but Anne-Marie was kind of at the centre of a very recent report on special educational needs and neurodivergent children and youth justice, commissioned by the Michael Seif Foundation. We'd be very happy to share that. I'm sure Anne-Marie would be very happy to share that. And it, you know, it had some real kind of stark findings. I mean, one of them, which I kind of jotted down in advance, was estimating about 80% of children who are cautioned or sentenced being SEND or neurodivergent. So, you know, huge numbers, really. And the report's really worth your time looking at. You know, it talks about a number of very, very implementable recommendations, which can make big differences to the way that we approach this. So I would recommend looking at that or talking to Anne-Marie, and we'd be very happy to sort of coordinate that.
Thanks, Tom and Nicole. I might not get through all of my 5 questions because you're not here to hear from me. But one thing I was interested in hearing more about was police practice. What changes can be made to police practice to improve the experiences of neurodivergent people?
I'll let you take that, Tom.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, you know, a lot of these kind of challenges, as I think Nicole has pointed out, are kind of common across different parts of the criminal justice system, often sort of being centered around things like awareness of neurodivergence, knowledge of identifying and then appropriately responding to neurodivergent witnesses, victims, suspects, defendants, and so on. And in terms of policing, I kind of think it's worth highlighting that as one of the very first points at which people are going to be drawn into the criminal justice system, that's a real critical stage when it can make all the difference to what happens later. You know, the earlier you can identify someone who requires a different approach, the more quickly you can implement a change, you know, divert away from the criminal justice process if appropriate. So I think it's just worth highlighting that kind of that almost gatekeeping role, I guess, that the police have is really important. And really, I think some form of accessible and sort of systematic screening could be kind of game changing in that regard. So I think that's probably the key thing I'd say.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to ask one final question, shared privilege, and then I'm going to hand over to Russell to invite questions from participants. How can working practices with regards to interventions in the community be enhanced for neurodivergent people particularly given the evidence suggests that neurodivergent people are more likely to drop out of programs?
I should take that one, I suppose. I should say, and if anyone's interested, I'm very happy to answer any questions and sort of share afterwards. But so right now I'm involved in sort of turning sort of 7-8 years worth of research into a toolkit practitioner guides, and I'm working in collaboration with several partners across the voluntary and statutory sector up here in the northeast, so Probation and Respect, and also with Criminal Justice Scotland, and that's about trying to develop something that practitioners can use when they're working with domestic abuse perpetrators who are neurodivergent. Now, while it's going to be domestic abuse specific, I would imagine that a lot of these things are going to be the same across board, without sort of the domestic abuse element, of course, added into that. I mean, some of the things that we'd already talking about, I think, like I've just said before, is about how do we get someone to the room in the first place? And there's lots of assumptions that we have to drop and reconsidering the processes that have been established, sort of expecting, I suppose, round pegs and square holes, etc. So what do your appointments look like? How do we get someone to a building who might have difficulties and challenges in thinking about sort of how to get there in the first place? What's the setup within the building, the noise, the light, the sort of the heating, for example, all of these different sorts of things. Do we expect face-to-face appointments? But then thinking more individually about those assessments. So there's generic things that we can do to make our organisations and services neurodivergent friendly from the outset. But what are the specific needs of that individual, and how do those vary from environment to environment? How do those vary if there's overlapping neurodivergences as well? So that those can often be pulling in sort of opposite directions. So one of the key things to do is think about, through your assessment processes, whatever that may look like in whatever shape or form, if you want someone to engage with a process, with a programme, with an intervention, we have to understand what those difficulties are to begin with, what that looks like, what it feels like, what it looks like, how a practitioner is going to know that it's happening for them, and what a practitioner can do and say in that moment, and prepare these plans in advance. I'm going to leave that there just because I know we want to move on to Russell and to audiences asking questions, and if any more come up around that, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Tom. You'll be pleased to know that's me done, and I am going to be handing over to Russell.
Lovely. Thanks, Sam. So we've got some questions already, which we'll get onto in a moment, but do please pop your question in the chat. Before we do, there's been a terrific amount of activity on the chat already, with people swapping a really wide range of resources, lived experience films, toolkits, training resources, books, etc. And I thought this might be a good moment for Nicole or Tom to give a plug to the network and encourage people to actually share all those resources if they haven't already. Can I ask you to say a couple of words on that, Nicole?
Yeah, sure. So we could pop in I think there's actually the link to it in the report itself. So actually Tom set the network originally. Tom founded the network, and I pestered him so much for 12 months about lots of different ideas and things that I thought would be really good, that he asked me to come on board and co-convene with him. So I was really pleased to do that. And he's been great to work alongside. And it was born out of sort of Tom not being able to sort of find the information that he needed in terms of research, and really acts as a switchboard. So the idea is that we want to ensure this isn't just about undertaking research, but making sure that whatever that we do is actually translated into practice, and sort of bringing the network together. So Tom and I, as part of that, have a newsletter, and there's also a resource which is actually in the process of being jazzed up, Tom, isn't it? There's going to be a new website and resource, sort of like a sort of more interactive resource bank. But what we will, we're very much welcome as people sending us their research, so that we can add that into the resource bank, so that it's accessible to anyone who's sort of a practitioner or a researcher, or someone who is neurodivergent themselves and looking for perhaps some information as well. I'm not sure if you want to say anything, Tom.
No, that really covers it. Thanks, Nicole. And just also, we refer to kind of network members, and that is literally as simple as tell us you want to be a member, and we'll add you to our mailing list, and that's it.
Lovely. So that's the Neurodivergence in Criminal Justice Network, and I've just popped the link in the chat, so anyone that wants to sign up can do so. Right, question time. It seemed a good place to start is a question from Joanna Foster, who's really asking about, is there a gender split when we talk about possibly half the people in prison being neurodivergent? Do we know if that's more or less likely to be men or women?
I mean, do you want to take this one, Nicole? Do you want me to?
You can start, and I'll come in if there's anything that I feel that's still.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I think probably the answer to that. Sorry, was it Joe who asked that? Joanne. Joanna. Apologies, Joanna. I think probably the answer to that is that we don't know for sure. But I think based on what we do know about a kind of male-female split in terms of neurodivergence generally, it's likely to be male prisons, the male estate, that has that division. But I would suspect that we just don't know enough, and that, you know, kind of assessments are not currently well set up or particularly effective at identifying neurodivergence in women. That is purely speculation from me. I don't think we really have data on that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Nicole.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think we know that the prison population is broadly made up of more of men than it is of women. And I suppose I sort of get this question when it comes to thinking about domestic abuse and neurodivergence, and people being concerned about sort of the stigmatization of neurodivergent people, because that's what you focus on. And actually, when we think about the majority of neurodivergent people are not assaulting their partners, and that the majority that do so are still men in that context as well. So, but yeah, I think this is certainly, in terms of prison population, when it comes down to data, something that we just don't have either, is it?
Lovely, thanks very much. And I'm going to move on to a kind of a related question really from Zara Wynn, who asks, has research been done into intersectionality, particularly between neurodiversity and race? Because and she says, from her experience, having done work with neurodivergent people in the criminal justice system, she sees the adultification of Black children and young people in particular, which feeds into that school to prison pipeline, and people misconstruing behaviours as aggression, non-compliance. So just, I think she was asking, is there research on that in particular?
Thanks for that, Zara, and nice to hear from you again. I think the answer to that is that it's quite limited still, that there isn't a particularly large body of research which covers intersectionality well enough or in a focused enough way. If there is, and someone's sat in the audience going, yeah, I'm doing that, please tell us, because a lot of the time we're trying to find research and essentially kind of disseminate it as widely as possible. But of course, we can only be aware of what we're aware of. So I'm not personally, but you know, it really needs kind of emphasis and focus now. And I'm really glad you kind of brought that up, because that's the problem.
Lovely, thank you very much. And then we're moving on to a question from Marilyn Jones. She says, from her experience, she knows that many neurodivergent people have no idea why they're struggling. Is there research out there on evidence around people being helped to understand themselves? She says, I feel much is done to help people work with the system rather than actually understanding how that their particular individual neurodivergence affects them, and that possibly would be more valuable to them.
I mean, you probably want to say something on this, I imagine, Nicole, because a lot of your work is around working with people quite directly. But before you do, I just wanted to say that my kind of view on it is that criminal justice often is not the right system to be dealing with the challenges that people are facing. And I think a lot of professionals in the criminal justice system aren't trained or in a position to do that effectively. And, you know, I feel like it'd be much more effective if we could divert people away into more appropriate places where they could be helped to understand and manage themselves, so that the criminal justice system wasn't even a part of the equation. But yeah, sorry, I'll
Never say sorry, Tom. Always got words of wisdom. Yeah, it's a tricky one. So one of the things that we're trying to do as part of the toolkit, so as well as I should have said, as well as working with the partners who obviously provide these interventions, these services, I'm working alongside 2 neurodivergent-led organisations, and I'm doing so because these are organisations that have been sort of developed by and for neurodivergent people, and it's been really useful in terms of thinking about how do we sort of draw on those skills and expertise, lived experience, as well as building businesses, organisations for people to support us in developing interventions with a neurodiversity hat on, so that we're not just putting neurodivergent people over there, neurotypical people over there. And one of the things that's coming up from practitioners, and we're trying to deal with this across the different sectors and with the neurodivergent-led organisations, is about obviously someone who doesn't always know they're neurodivergent. We can ask people when they come into the service if they are, and we're looking at some prompt questions around how to do that in a sensitive way. So rather than having a tick box exercise, always having these supplementary questions. But what do we do when someone doesn't know themselves that they're neurodivergent, and trying to sort of develop some questions around that? One of the more tricky things that we're trying to do as well as part of this is trying to get them to understand, and this has come through research, and it has to be done in a really sensitive way while trying to still understand the power dynamics that are involved when we think about domestic abuse. But so there's something that's come out that looks at the difference between coercively controlling behaviour and what I've termed so far as environment control or structural control. So where neurodivergent people have to often sort of control their environment because it hasn't been built for them. And how do we look at that in terms of thinking about abusive behaviours that are controlling versus behaviours that are about anxiety, predictability, managing anxiety, coping and providing predictability? And how do those both intersect? So it's a really complex area of work and understanding, and trying to think and get someone to understand what is part of me, what is part of me being neurodivergent that makes me behave in particular ways, and what is it that I do that is abusive, and how do those two overlap? Because ultimately, even if the intent behind it is to control the environment, to provide predictability, it's what the expectation is on the partner and what the consequences are for them. So I'm not sure if I fully sort of answered what you were saying there in terms of how do we get them to understand themselves, but that's what we're looking at in the context of domestic abuse, trying to understand offending behaviour at the same time as trying to understand how that intersects with being neurodivergent.
Thanks very much, Nicole. That's making my brain struggle just to get my head around how I would try and do that. I'm glad you're doing it. A really helpful question, I think, from Zoe Clark, who says, do you know how neurodivergent prison staff are supported to carry out their role? She says it seems really important to have neurodivergent staff working with so many neurodivergent prisoners. And obviously, if they feel comfortable to be open about their own diagnosis, strengths, challenges, etc. We have a response from Stacey Stern saying that there are neurodiversity support managers who are supposed to have that role, both with prisoners and staff, but wondered if you and Tom knew any more about that.
That's a really, really great question. And I mean, the first thing I think is it's really good to highlight the role now of neurodiversity support managers. There's quite a few who are members of the network. So if there are any more of you out there who want to join to be able to kind of share experience and connect with people who want support or advice, then, you know, please do. I mean, I can't comment too directly on prisons because that's not my area so much. So Nicole might be able to possibly talk more about it, or someone like Luke, who we mentioned earlier. But it's really timely to talk about the experience of neurodivergent practitioners. I think this is being talked about more now. I'm involved in a book that's sort of about midway through development at the moment, and I'm currently reading a chapter which is about neurodivergent police officers and the challenges for neurodivergent police officers operating in that environment. And I think you could transfer that question across to different areas, not only because it's obviously going to be very challenging and excluding if criminal justice is not set up in a way that's neuro-inclusive, but we lose the benefit of people's experience and understanding as neurodivergent people to improve the services we deliver for neurodivergent witnesses, suspects, defendants, whoever it might be. In terms of prisons specifically, I don't know, Nicole, if you had any kind of thoughts you wanted to add on that.
Prison obviously is outside of my area expertise, but it's something that I have focused on in my research. So I interviewed practitioners from programmes, domestic abuse perpetrator programmes in sort of 5 different countries a few years ago. And some of those were neurodivergent practitioners. And my gosh, the conversations that come out of that research was just incredible, in the expertise and skills and their ability to be able to, I loved how they said, like, think outside of the square rather than think outside of the box, think outside of the square, that no one had to translate for them in terms of when they were working with a neurodivergent client, and I suppose that the diversity of practice that neurodivergent people bring. So we need neurodivergent, we need neurotypical. The problem is that workforces are not set up for it, and we're failing our staff as well as the clients that are coming in. So it needs much more research and much more thought.
I mean, one thing that does occur is thinking about like police custody, which I know is also obviously not the same as a prison environment, but it's got, some of those similarities of things like detention, sensory stress, rigid routines, safety and kind of risk implications. There's been some lots of really good work done by people like Chloe Holloway-George, who was one of our contributors on making police custody more neurodivergent friendly, which is clearly not just a benefit to people detained, but people working in those environments. So I think perhaps looking at some of that would be really beneficial.
There's a lot of conversation on the chat, kind of unsurprisingly, I think, on how important lived experience is to inform what happens to accommodate the needs of people with neurodivergence. And Evan Davis from Unlock says, how can researchers really make sure that people with neurodivergence are able to contribute and set the focus points for future research, which I know you'll probably both want to answer, because I know the network is, aims to kind of fulfill that need. But let me shut up and let you talk.
Didn't know if did you want to go first, Nicole?
No, because I totally missed the question because I was too busy reading the chat. So you will have to tell me what the question is, then answer it, and then I'll see if I have anything to contribute.
No, totally fine. I mean, it's, as a researcher, it's in this field, it's a kind of really big part of the conversation now, particularly that sort of principle of, nothing without us. The idea that if you want people to be truly kind of impacted appropriately, then you should be building in lived experience from the beginning. So I think that's kind of the simple answer. The idea that when you are going to develop any kind of project in this field, that kind of co-design element is happening from the very beginning. And I think there's lots of really great examples of that out there. I mean, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. There was one I actually tried to get involved in myself. I'm neurodivergent, as a sort of a neurodivergent person rather than as a researcher, which was about both education and criminal justice. And I think, and that was very early stage. It was at the point of, way before like bidding for funding or, doing surveys or doing interviews. It was right at the sort of ideas design stage. So I think, to me, I think that's the answer, is that it's something that should be part of the process from the beginning. But that requires people to have sort of time and a team to be able to do that, and that's always difficult for everybody, I think, not least researchers.
Thanks, Tom. Nicole, did you want to chip in?
I suppose I would just say that so just now I'm sort of in a consultancy advisory capacity, working with, I don't think they've announced it yet, so I won't say anything. That will be up for their comms, but looking at a 3-year project which is overhauling a programme to make sure that the processes, so my sort of toolkit that I'm doing will sit alongside that, some sort of at some level thinking about processes, etc. But this is actually looking at overhauling the entirety of the programme to think about how do we make this about neurodiversity from the start, and that has several people involved sort of across the sectors, but also looking at lived experience specialists from neurodivergent-led organisations. So I'm really excited to see where that goes, because as Tom says, this is where it needs to start if we want to be building interventions that work for everyone. And they won't work for everyone. We need to try and build them to be more likely to have everyone in mind. There's always going to be people neurodivergent, neurotypical, otherwise, that won't be able to. But yeah, this sort of co-design, co-research, that everything needs to be done with sort of all the different minds in the room, really.
I mean, it just as a final chip in on that, because this is such an important thing. I think I try and think of it in the same way I would if I'm like doing teaching, because I'm a lecturer as well, and Nicole also is. That if I want my students to turn up and I want my students to engage with what I'm doing and for it to be effective, I need to talk to them. I need to find out what's going to work. I need to find out how to understand their needs, and that needs to happen from the beginning, rather than me saying, right, here is the thing, go off and do it. I think that kind of philosophy of just asking and having a dialogue is at the very least what can be done in research.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple of last questions. Kate Lill asked a couple of questions, but if you don't mind, Kate, I'm just going to pick one of those, which I'm guessing Nicole might have a view on. Is there any research on how the needs of neurodivergent women overlap and interact with the trauma-informed approach? Because obviously your work with perpetrators will, I think, kind of bear on the other side of that equation, if you like, or people that are victims.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on whether, are we talking about women as victims or women as perpetrators here? Do we know, or should I just assume we're talking about women as perpetrators because we're talking about criminal justice?
I think we're just talking about women generally, in terms of if someone is working with a neurodivergent woman in the criminal justice system, in terms of that approach, does that overlap with trauma-informed practice? How might those things interact?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on trauma-informed practice, and sometimes I think we haven't quite got it right in terms of what we mean by trauma-informed, so I'm not going to say anything while something's being recorded and then I'm forever out there having communicated something on trauma-informed practice that perhaps I'm not an expert on talking about. However, what I would say that has come up through the research and working with male perpetrators within this context and thinking about how we engage someone, how we relate, how we sort of need to sort of be curious and meet someone where they're at, that when we're talking about this in the context then of neurodivergence, we have to keep in mind sort of all those lived experiences of trauma, discrimination, stigma that they have experienced through their life, and how that intersects with the ways in which they're behaving, but also in terms of how we then present when we're I suppose trying to get them to engage in an intervention. Like, there's not much again, I don't think there's much research there in terms of thinking about women as perpetrators in this context yet. I'm not sure if there might be someone, I think I saw someone on someone's name on the call before who does do work with victim survivors in this context that might be worth connecting them with as well. So I will leave that there.
Thanks, Nicole. We have got so many people on every question. So if anyone, any participants can answer questions about, are there resources particularly around accommodation advice for neurodiverse people in the criminal justice system, or if and what kind of training prison and probation staff get around neurodivergence. But the question I wanted to end with from Louise Venables, because it just seemed appropriate for you both, is how do we start working together to make changes within the criminal justice system consistently? And she says, including reasonable adjustments for people that haven't yet been diagnosed or might be on a waiting list. So just generally that we're much more aware that different people need different things in what are almost by definition really stressful situations.
I mean, yeah, that's an incredibly important question and probably the hardest one to answer. I mean, I think to begin with, the fact that there are now more of these kind of events and conversations happening is like the very first step, like actually having kind of sharing of information and experience. And I hope that in our way, the network can contribute to that by having a centralized place for that. There needs to be a sort of better joined up approach across the various stages of the criminal justice system. And I think one of the problems with that is sort of responsibility lying in different places and people having a bit of a siloed approach to, oh, well, this is my bit of criminal justice. I don't need to worry about that bit. And, you know, it's simply not, it's simply an artificial distinction ultimately. So having, I think, more of that dialogue between practitioners and professionals working across stages would be absolutely crucial. Hopefully that could, to a degree, be coordinated by central kind of bodies like, you know, the prison service or, you know, or police leadership, for example. How likely that is anybody's guess. I think, you know, money, time, resource, focus being pulled all over the place is always a problem. But at the very least, I think there being a community of practice and a community of expertise, which consistently has this kind of dialogue, is probably the number one way to keep this issue alive and on the radar of the people who need to have it on their radar. So I know that's not really an answer, but it's kind of, I hope.
Thanks, Tom. No, absolutely. I think it's, you know, there's not a magic answer, is it? It is about awareness. It is about people having these conversations, having them routinely and regularly, and at the start of when they're planning new services, new resources, as well as looking at the way they work at the moment. Nicole, would you like a last word before I hand back to Sam?
No, I would just echo what Tom said there, and I think that stood out quite a lot when we first started having meetings. If you remember, when we were trying to talk about different research, how we come together, what we need to do, when we were sort of speaking to sort of prisons and probation originally. And there is so much work going on out there when you actually start to gather it all in. I would imagine there's so many good things being done that we just haven't heard about yet, that isn't being promoted, that isn't in the one place, and there's so many different bits of things going on. So yeah, it would be amazing if something could be more, something centralized. Or in the meantime, we'll just use the network, shall we, and share our resources and try linking people up and use it as the switchboard we intend it to be.
And just to say, really appreciate the number of comments in the chat. I really sorry we can't engage with it directly. My brain can't do chat and talk. But any questions or resources or anything you have that you want to share, please just send them to us. The more the better, really.
Lovely. So thank you very much, both of you, for all that. Thank you everyone for contributing. If anyone has got those resources to share, The link is in the chat, but also you only need to Google neurodivergence in criminal justice network and you will find it. As Tom and Nicole say, it's there's no vetting process. You're free to just say I'd like to join, then you'll be joined and you'll have access to contribute and to share and to access all the resources that are already there. Sam, back to you.
Thanks so much, Russell. I think you have broken some form of record that we've done this within time with about 90 seconds to spare. I just wanted to thank Tom and Nicole wholeheartedly for all of your work on this, and to all of the other contributors to the review. I think it's safe to say that this has been the most viewed review and the most engaged with session in terms of the number of people that are here today, which shows you how important the work is. So we really, really do appreciate it.